For my data project, I performed an analysis of several potential predictor variables for the number of turns played in a game of chess. I used a data set of 20,000 chess games which were played on lichess.com, which data set I found on kaggle.com. At the outset of my analysis, I identified 6 predictor variables to investigate, those being the increment in turns per second, meaning the amount of time that's added after each player plays a move to their clock, the time per player in minutes given at the start of the game, the result of whether the game was decisive or drawn, whether the game was rated, the average rating of the 2 participating players, and the difference in rating between the 2. I analyzed the predictors in that order, hypothesizing at the outset that the presence of increment and the size of the increment value would be the strongest prediction of turn number, since games with no or low increment are more likely to end in a sudden blunder or loss of time. And related to time control, there's also the time in minutes variable, which increment and time in minutes are likely to be 2 potentially collinear variables in this analysis. The reason being I split the time control information that was provided in the document because it provided information in a time in minutes plus and then increment in seconds format, which was easiest to break into 2 separate variables for this analysis. Regarding the outcome of a game, I predicted that drawn games would last significantly longer than decisive games due to long endgames of players maneuvering back and forth for potentially extended periods. Rating, whether or not a game was rated, also seemed a notable factor of consideration, as I expected players would linger longer to defend worse positions in rated games than unrated ones. Finally, regarding the average rating of players in a game and the rating difference between them, I expected initially that increase in the average rating would increase the average number of turns played, but that contrarily, an increase in the rating difference between the players, meaning that one is significantly stronger than the other, would likely result in shorter games with fewer moves played. Initially, you can see a histogram to showing the number of turns played in chess, which is somewhat Poisson distributed since it's waiting for the end of the game event. And the vast majority of games occur with 50 or fewer moves, but there are some that go up into 100 or even multiple 100 turns. For data tidying, from the raw data, I had to do a fair bit of cleaning up. The only entry that I used mostly unmodified was the rated column, which was a Boolean variable true false that I turned into a simple 0 for drawn games, 1 for decisive results. For the time control, as I mentioned, I split the full time control variable provided into increment and time in minutes. For both of those, I created histogram showing the distribution as well. For both, you can see that for these online games, the vast majority were played in shorter time formats of 10 minutes or fewer, and with 10 seconds of increment or less on the clock. There were a small number of games with an increment of 180 at the very top of the distribution. Ditto a couple of games that had a time control of 180 minutes. But when both of these were removed from the histograms and limited to where the vast majority of the data lies, clearer trends emerged. For outcome, there were 4 potential outcomes in the raw data. Draw, checkmate, one player running out of time, or a player resigning. The latter 3 results are all decisive of either white win the game or black win the game. So I combined them into a single outcome and created the related box plot showing that indeed the number of turns played in drawn games is both higher on average and median and more broadly distributed than that played in decisive games. There is the single outlier of the 350 move decisive game, but that I removed from the data since it is not reflective of any of the other trends seen for these variables. Finally, for the variables of the average rating of the players in the game versus the rating difference of players in the game, you can see for the first one that there are games played between players rated less than 1,000 to players whose average rating is 2,500 or even higher in some few cases, which is on the very high end of chess capability. But regardless of the average rating of the players, there seems to be no clear trend emerging as to the number of turns played. Even at a glance, it looks like a horizontal bar would fit more or less best across that. Whereas with the rating difference between players, it is first clustered around closely matched games. There's not a ton of games with a huge differential between the players, but in those games where there is, the resulting games tend to have fewer moves played. So there is something of a negative or downward trend between an increase in rating difference and the expected number of turns that would be played in the game. Then, right before starting my analysis of the model itself, or the model since I did 6 successive ones, you can see the 6 variables along with the mean, median, variance, and standard deviation of each. You can see that the increment and the time control both range from values from 0 to 180 seconds per turn added for increment, or 180 starting minutes for the time in minutes. The outcomes are either drawn or decisive, rated with 0 or 1. And the average rating between the players followed the substantial deviation as I noted in the graphs above. Same with the substantial range of possible rating differences present in these games. In the covariant matrix, the details that stood out most to me were ones that may have resulted from the way I performed this analysis, namely the high level of covariance between the increment and the time in minutes, most likely resulted from the splitting of that variable to turn the character format provided into a simpler analysis. Best in the future might be, if this analysis were performed again, to simply include one or the other, seeing as including both seems to have been redundant and may have accounted for some inaccuracy in the rating. Similarly, for the last variables, the average rating of the players and the rating difference between them, I found that there was high covariance between the 2 of those, especially compared to all the other variables here, which again, maybe makes some sense on reflection. For the average rating of players in the game, it is likely to be higher. And for a high ratings differential, at least one of the players in the game has to be highly rated. And in fact, for a high differential, we'd have to have one high rated and one low rated player, which would not clearly be reflected in the average rating since it would end up right in between the 2 strengths. Finally, for the analysis itself, I use the simpler linear model moving through 6 formats, starting with the simple fitted model of increment and intercept against turns, which fitted graph can be seen down below here. Up above are the quick view of the results from the 6 models that I ran. The first one with just the increment, then with increment and the time in minutes, and the third one with those 2 plus outcome, then adding on whether or not the game was rated, the average rating, and finally the rating difference between the players. In each of them, I found that the fitted coefficients all had statistically significant p-values, mostly around 2 to the negative 16th, or 2e to the negative 16 was the most common result seen. But I also found that even as I added on more variables, the R squared fit of the model stayed shockingly low. The first model of just increment versus turns played ended up almost flat, with an R squared very close to 0 and a slightly negative value for turns, actually showing that as the increment increases, average number of turns may decrease slightly, which is a counterintuitive result that is supported by all the coefficients fitted for the increment value throughout this analysis, and is matched by a similar trend for the time in minutes, that as in each case, the fitted coefficient is negative. So as the time available to each player in the game increases, the number of moves actually played in the game decreases somewhat. Both of those could be explained by players having more time to find precise moves and thus find and perform decisive attacks or tactics. But I'd say that further analysis is necessary given how contrary to my expectations those 2 fittings were. Once I added on a variable for outcome, clearer trends emerged. Although the R squared value remains unexplanative relative to the total scope of what causes variance in chess turns at just 2 or 0.028 for model 3. The fit for outcome shows that there is a significant difference that can be expected between whether or not the result was decisive or drawn. Specifically, since draws are given a value of 0 and decisive games a value of 1, the negative coefficient given in each of models 3 to 6 for this parameter show that in all cases, the expectation is that decisive games will have significantly fewer turns played. Moving on to model 4, rated games show the opposite trend. Unrated games were ranked as 0, rated games as a 1. And in this case, the positive coefficients show that indeed players do tend to stick around and play more turns out in rated games than unrated games. And that adds a little bit of explanatory power to the model, but even through models 4, 5, and 6, the highest R squared rate I achieved was about 0.07. And since each added variable has a tendency to increase the R squared as well, the explanatory power of this model is something that I would definitely put into question. There's still a great deal of explanation to be done before I would say that we have any confident prediction of number of turns in chess based on the specific factors analyzed here. In conclusion of this analysis, in each model, the coefficients were all significant based on the p-values. And in each model, the trend shown, whether or not the fitted coefficient was positive or negative, didn't flip, showing that there's at least not too much noise regarding expectations related to each variable, but the impact specifically that each has on who's predicted and those variables' ability to explain variance in chess games appears pretty minimal. I mentioned a couple points of potential collinearity that might be addressed in a further delving analysis of this question. Additionally, the data set I found was drawn from Lichess, so it would be interesting to acquire data for games played on another format such as chess.com to see if there is variance in the results of the analysis depending on the format of the games. Similarly, it would be fascinating to see whether or not these results hold out in games played in person, whether or not they are quick, like 5-minute blitz games or multiple hour tournament games. Though gathering data on such play is much more difficult than it is gathering the online data set that I used here. And in addition, the data set that I found contained full information on the moves played in each game, along with a note of the corresponding ECO, which is a catalog of chess openings that relates to the first few series of moves played. There's a huge amount of variation within the openings and even within the ECO, so I opted to omit any detailed analysis of it from this project, but it would be fascinating to see whether or not, or the effect that different opening moves have on the number of turns played in a game, and if there's any significant predictive power of what one can expect even after the first move or first few moves have been played on the board. A quick review. This is a copy of the raw data that I used for this analysis. This is the cleaned up data frame that I used for the specific variables of interest once I tidied them up. This is a simple map of each of the models I did with the variables included. Quick looks at the fitted model coefficients, standard error, residual plots for each of these models. And finally, this little overview of my findings, which again, with that R squared of 0.06978, doesn't make me feel like I have fully explored the causes of variance in turns in chess. I do also find it worth noting that chess itself just inherently may have a high level of variance in turn numbers that's difficult to explain by any single factor of analysis or even multiple potential factors here. Might be interesting to do an analysis on individual player ratings to see if there's a trend between lower rated players playing shorter games or longer ones, but we already saw from the average rating variable that the strength of the two players in the game doesn't seem to have a significant influence, and lower rated players then would only be a factor of length if they're playing against higher rated players, and we're looking at the rating differential option. With that said, that concludes my analysis for today. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you.